Good evening and welcome to this event. This is a keynote speech which is associated with the Global Trade Academy. So I'd first like to make a pitch. We have a Global Trade Academy going on all week. Some of the people who are participating in that academy are here live tonight. Others of them are watching us from various different places around the world. So welcome to everybody who's a participant in the Academy, but also to everybody else who has come here, including, hello, Fernanda, my friend who is visiting. I'd like to thank Visa very much, by the way, for supporting this reception and keynote speech. We're really very, very happy to have with us here today Deputy Director General Angela Paolini Ellard, who most of you probably know, but I have a little biographical blurb that I think I'll read to you anyway. Angela has served as the WTO Deputy Director General since June 2021. Before her appointment, she had a distinguished career serving in the US Congress as Majority and Minority Chief Trade Counsel for over 26 years. And although she doesn't know me, I know her because in the Trade Update used to every year have a panel where the trade councils were there. So I watched you several times in that. She's internationally recognized as an expert on trade and international economic policy, resolving trade and investment barriers, negotiating trade agreements, supporting multilateral solutions as part of an effective trade and development policy. She has negotiated and delivered significant bipartisan trade policy outcomes and legislation with members of US Congress and senior Biden, Trump, Obama, Bush, and Clinton administration officials. She was also a lawyer in the private sector, specializing in trade litigation and strategy, trade policy, and legislative issues. She has a Juris Doctor cum laude from Tulane University School of Law, Master of Arts in Public Policy, also from Tulane, a Bachelor of Arts from Newcomb College of Tulane University, summa cum laude, frequent lecturer at law, graduate, undergraduate, and classes. She's received numerous awards recognizing her accomplishments in trade, law, and policy. And she is here today to talk with us about digital trade, challenges, and opportunities. She's going to give perhaps a 20, 25-minute address. And afterwards, there will be an opportunity for questions from the floor. And we will also have an opportunity for Global Trade Academy participants who are elsewhere in the world to send in questions via chat. So you don't really want to hear any more from me. So I'm going to yield the floor to Angela. Thank you very much, Angela, for being here with us.
Well, good evening, everyone. I first want to thank Georgetown, the Georgetown Law School's Institute of International Economic Law, Global Trade Academy. It's really a privilege to be here. I'm so honored to be invited and so very glad to be doing an event in person, hybrid, but with in-person people. And we have a guest from another guest from Geneva as well. So Gabrielle, if you haven't met her, from the WTO. I'm also glad to see how much this event has grown over the years since I first started to participate in it. It's really gratifying to see the level of interest. And I'm so glad to see in the audience tonight a combination of people from the private sector, people from think tanks, people who know trade inside and out, who work for government, who have worked for government, and then the new generation of trade lawyers and trade specialists and policymakers. So that's a great combination and very exciting for me. So my topic is digital trade, opportunities and challenges, which is an easy topic and a difficult topic at the same time. So I will try my best with it to make some comments that I hope you'll find relevant, but I'm also looking forward to the Q&A period to see what's on your mind. So my first question to you is, what springs to mind when you think about international trade? Is it the nuts and bolts of trade, such as large container ships at the port of Shanghai, Los Angeles, or Rotterdam? Or For you trade lawyers, is it trade disputes that you think about, such as the steel and aluminum case, the washers case, large civil aircraft, which all concern trade in goods? Or maybe it's semiconductor chips, which preoccupy many policymakers these days. I was on the Hill for the last 2 days, so certainly hearing a lot about that. Well, any of those, of course, would be a good answer. But international trade today is increasingly more about intangibles, things we can't see or touch, but which represent a major share of GDP in many countries. For example, in 2021, almost 78% of the US GDP was generated by services. And I remember from my days on the Hill, the statistic that in every congressional district in the United States, about 70 to 80% of employment was based on services. In a similar vein, just as 78% of US GDP generated by services, around half of India's and China's GDPs come from services. In 2021, global services exports were valued at 6 trillion US dollars, representing over 1/5 of total world trade in both goods and services. And at the WTO, we estimate that the share of services in world trade could reach 1/3 by 2040. And this isn't even the full picture because it doesn't account for all the different ways in which services may be traded. For example, mode 3, which is commercial presence, is not included in my estimate. A significant part of this increase is due to technological developments, which have made services deliverable remotely. It's now commonplace for us to stream music on Spotify, take a language course on Babbel, or sweat through a fitness class remotely with a trainer from abroad. Exports of digitally delivered services have more than tripled since 2005. Between 2005 and 2019, the average annual growth rate of digitally delivered services exceeded 7%. By contrast, other services exports grew only by less than 6% and goods by less than 5%. This trend accelerated further, as we all know, during the pandemic. Exports of digitally delivered services leapt up by almost 1/3 in 2021 compared to 2019. For years, we've been hearing about the end of globalization or deglobalization. But such a demise has been greatly exaggerated, to borrow from Samuel Clemens. Instead, the nature of globalization is changing, and trade in intangibles, such as services, plays an increasingly important role. Trade in services will continue to increase as we enter the era of intangible globalization, a term coined by Norwegian officials. We also see potential in the digitization of trade through innovations like digital finance, customs e-declarations, and AI-assisted supply management tools, which can cut total trade costs by at least 6%. However, to fully realize all this potential for digital trade and the value and growth it brings, we need to do a couple of things. First, we have to bridge the digital divide between developed and developing countries. More on that in a moment. Second, we also have to address the many existing impediments to trade in services, such as barriers to cross-border payments and data flows, commercial presence requirements to supply services, and restrictions on foreign investment and on the ability of people to move abroad to supply services. In that regard, I note the important work carried out jointly by the WTO and the World Bank to survey and quantify services trade policies in about 130 economies, including information on all these types of policies. This information, for those of you who'd like to check it out, is publicly available on our website. The current WTO framework regulating trade in services and technology was put in place in 1995, which is light years ago in technology terms. WTO members are working to improve the existing tools and develop new ones to reflect the changing nature of trade. So let me elaborate on some of that work. I'll start with the work WTO members have been doing at the multilateral level. At our 12th Ministerial Conference, MC12, last June, WTO members agreed by consensus, and I should just a parenthetical here to say, those of you who know the WTO know this very well, that any decision in the WTO has to be made by consensus. That's 167 members who have to somehow come to agreement or at least agree not to disagree. So when I say that members reached an agreement by consensus at MC12, that is meaningful. And that agreement is to extend until our next ministerial conference the longstanding moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions, which has been periodically reviewed since 1998, but it's not permanent. This issue does not get much limelight with the public at large, but many businesses view it as tremendously important because it preserves a trade policy environment that is supportive of e-commerce in general, not just regarding duties on these transmissions, but non-tariff barriers and red tape. The main point of disagreement between those who support the extension of the moratorium and those who do not relates to its scope and potential economic effects. On the one hand, some developing countries, such as India, South Africa, Indonesia, they see the moratorium as detrimental to raising customs revenue. Some studies, in fact, estimate that the amount of lost revenue is between $280 million and $10 billion per year. On the other hand, developed and many developing countries argue that any extra tariff revenue would be outweighed by negative economic consequences that country would see in the form of higher prices and reduced consumption, and maybe even reduced supply, which would slow down GDP growth and shrink tax revenues. The extension of the moratorium will be one of the issues trade ministers will have to address at our 13th ministerial conference in Abu Dhabi next February. So discussions will continue in the coming months to address the gap between these two positions. At MC12, ministers also agreed to reinvigorate work under the work program on e-commerce. And by the way, at the WTO, we call it e-commerce still, not digital trade, but the term has expanded, of course, to include all of those elements. So the work program on e-commerce is a longstanding framework for members' deliberation on all trade-related issues relating to global e-commerce. Development-related issues feature prominently in this work. In particular, members have been discussing the digital divide in terms of digital infrastructure, connectivity, affordability, and capacity building. Our joint research with the World Bank suggests that improved access to technology would be particularly beneficial for women and MSMEs, micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. 38% of MSMEs are female-owned. According to the International Telecommunications Union, in 2022, only 19% of women in least developed countries and 50% in developing countries, only 19% of women in those countries use the internet, compared to 86% in the developed world. Access to a smartphone, the internet, and relevant digital skills can help women gain access to finance, start a business, sell products in new markets, and obtain or provide health and educational services. And that in turn benefits their families and communities. So better internet access has a multiplier effect on development, particularly as it enables leapfrogging over technologies that are already becoming obsolete. So in addition to these multilateral efforts to update WTO rules on services and digital economy also take place through what we call at the WTO joint initiatives. These are initiatives among groups of members or coalitions of the willing instead of multilateral negotiations or plurilateral approach, sometimes called. Negotiators are pursuing this initial because they seek a depth and breadth of coverage that's proven elusive at the multilateral level. Although, of course, participants do hope that all members would eventually participate. Before I describe these plurilateral initiatives, these joint initiatives, I must take note that some WTO members don't support such arrangements or even negotiations at this level, because they consider that the WTO should be engaged only in multilateral initiatives. At the same time, however, supporters point to our founding documents to demonstrate that plurilateral agreements form part of the WTO architecture. They are often the only way forward on some issues, and they can lead to multilateral agreements in the future when the rest of the membership is ready. So those are the arguments that are raised by supporters. There are 3 joint initiatives at the WTO aimed at developing new disciplines on services, digital trade, and investment. First, in 2021, 70 members representing 92.5% of global services trade, so an overwhelming amount of global services trade. They concluded negotiations on services domestic regulation, and they're currently in the process of implementing it. Many services sectors are, for good reason, highly regulation intensive and require service providers to obtain licenses, certifications, or permits to demonstrate their ability to supply services in accordance with those regulations. Think of financial services, for example. But the administration of these regulations can be complex and non-transparent, making it difficult for foreign service providers to navigate the regulatory landscape. So the purpose of this initiative, Services Domestic Regulation, is to simplify authorization processes, cut red tape, and increase transparency and predictability for service providers, including MSMEs, micro, small, and medium enterprises. We have a lot of abbreviations in the trade world. It's expected that these new rules will help reduce the costs of global services trade by more than 150 billion US dollars per year. The initiative also marks, this is very interesting, I think, it marks the first time in the WTO's history that a gender equality provision was included in the text of a WTO outcome. Specifically, members have committed to non-discrimination between men and women in their services regulations, paving the way for women's economic empowerment through participation in services trade. So we're particularly proud of this outcome and hope that this will be an example for our future trade initiatives. Now, I note that implementation of the domestic regulation agreement has been complicated by an objection from India and South Africa to the submission of the updated services schedules. So this is what you have to do in order to be in compliance with the new agreement. You have to update your WTO services schedule. And this objection relates to the question of whether plurilateral initiatives are appropriate for WTO negotiations, as I mentioned earlier. The members are now engaging in consultations, and we hope that it will be resolved quickly, but there's still several steps to take. A second area of work in the WTO that has gained considerable attention these days in our joint initiatives is the ongoing plurilateral joint initiative on e-commerce. 88 of our WTO members, so more than half, including many developing countries, and even a few least developed countries, participate in this effort to develop baseline rules governing the global digital economy. Participants are seeking to establish common disciplines to facilitate remote transactions and strengthen trust in digital markets. The disciplines discussed address both trade facilitative issues, such as e-signatures, online consumer protection, and paperless trade, as well as trade restrictive measures in the digital sphere, such as cross-border data flows and data localization. Participants are aiming to substantially conclude these negotiations by the end of the year, so the work is very intensive right now. It's noteworthy that members participating in the initiative recognize the significance of ensuring that digital trade is inclusive, as well as addressing the obstacles faced by developing and least developed countries seeking to benefit from the digital economy. In this regard, the e-commerce capacity building framework launched by Australia, Japan, Singapore, and Switzerland is a key step to strengthen digital inclusion and to help harness the opportunities of digital trade. The framework will offer a wide range of technical assistance, training, and capacity building to support the participation of developing countries in the e-commerce negotiations. So this framework, I think, is designed to give an opportunity for developed countries to provide assistance to make sure that developing countries really can participate. And this has, I think, created a lot of incentive for developing countries to participate so that they can realize the benefits of this negotiation instead of just simply being left behind. In our third WTO initiative, more than 110, it's more than 2/3 of WTO members, have been working hard to reach an agreement on investment facilitation for development, which would help particularly developing members improve their investment climate and attract, retain, and expand foreign direct investment. The pandemic and the war in Ukraine have weakened global FDI flows. And the expectation is that this agreement will help countries attract new investments, including in the areas of services and digital economy. To achieve this goal, the agreement aims at enhancing transparency and predictability of investment measures, speeding up and streamlining investment-related authorization procedures, improving international cooperation and information sharing, and promoting sustainable investment. The agreement also has a strong development component. For example, in parallel to the negotiations, participating members are working on needs assessments to help developing and LDC members identify their implementation gaps, as well as technical assistance and capacity building needs to implement the agreement. Preliminary estimates show that the investment facilitation for development agreement could increase global welfare by between 0.56 and 1.74%, depending on the depth of a potential deal, with the highest welfare increase going to low and middle income countries. We might have a deal on the text quite soon, as participating members aim to finalize the text negotiations by the middle of this year. In addition to these three initiatives, some industry associations are pushing to expand the coverage of the WTO Information Technology Agreement, the ITA, a series of 2 plurilateral agreements that slash duties on IT products. During the pandemic, dozens of products covered under ITA 2, such as pulse oximeters, played a key role in saving lives. Furthermore, access to IT products and information and telecommunications infrastructure is paramount for the engagement of small business in e-commerce. In other words, extending the scope of the ITA would also spur trade in services. In addition to these initiatives, our members are engaging in discussions regarding technology-related issues in various specialized committees within the WTO. For example, members have been increasingly notifying the WTO's Committee on Technical Barriers to Trade about their measures affecting digital products, e-commerce, and cybersecurity. The level of interest in these topics is really quite high, so high that in the next meeting of the committee will actually hold some special sessions on current challenges and best practices. Let me now say a couple of words about the role of technology in the green transition, because I think this is particularly exciting. Trade is often seen as a contributor to climate change through emissions caused by the production and transportation of goods. But this view is incomplete because international trade and the WTO as the guardian of the multilateral trade rules can be part of the solution to help climate goals be achieved. To transition to a low carbon economy, countries need affordable access to advanced technologies. And open trade plays a vital role in providing such access. Lowering barriers to trade in environmental goods and services would help facilitate the transfer and deployment of climate change mitigation and adaptation technologies. Wind turbines, solar panels, water heaters, hydropower turbines, and equipment for biogas production have to move across borders as freely as possible if we want to achieve our climate goals. Our WTO analysis suggests that eliminating tariffs and reducing non-tariff measures on some energy-related environmental goods and environmentally preferable products could increase global exports of these products by 5% and 14% respectively by 2030. This boost in the use of climate-friendly technologies could lead to a reduction of net carbon emissions by 0.6%. That is really significant. And all it takes is reducing tariffs and maybe some other regulatory barriers on these products to make it easier for countries to buy them. Trade in environmental goods goes hand in hand with environmental services. Installation and operation of clean technology is often complex and requires specialized skills that can be difficult to source domestically. Removing barriers on environmental services, such as environmental consulting and engineering or soil conservation services, can also help reduce costs of projects that lower emissions. Market opening in these sectors can also be a powerful tool for economic development by generating economic growth and employment. For example, the rooftop installation costs of photovoltaic modules accounts for approximately 60% of the total cost. The installation is 60% of the total cost, which of course includes the equipment itself. So we create a broad range of jobs through tariff liberalization. A growing number of jobs, especially in Africa, are being created in off-grid decentralized renewables, which also boosts employment in other sectors, such as agro-processing, healthcare, communications, and local commerce. Given the WTO's broad membership, which includes countries with different political systems and levels of development, we offer at the WTO a unique forum for discussions on reducing barriers to environmental goods and services and facilitating international cooperation, which is crucial for the green transition. But all is not rosy in the world of trade and technology. In fact, my final point is that technology is also the source of many trade tensions today. For many countries, technology is at the heart of foreign policy, national and economic security, and geopolitical frictions. And the stresses are becoming more and more profound. In the last couple of years, we've witnessed attempts to onshore, nearshore, or friendshore supply chains for sensitive technology, which has fueled the deglobalization narrative. Given the strains put on global supply chains, first by the pandemic and the war in Ukraine, the temptation to do business only with friends, however you define that, is understandable, even if it increased costs a little or even a lot. But the consequences of taking this too far will be counterproductive, in my view. Less resilience, more vulnerabilities, and greater exposure to shocks. This is especially true given increasingly frequent and more intense natural and man-made disasters, such as extreme weather events and climate change, pandemics, and armed conflicts. The simple fact is that not one single country or even a few countries can produce everything or even most things domestically. The key to supply chain resilience is therefore more international cooperation and more diverse supply chains, not fewer. Moreover, consider other unintended consequences of isolationism. Our research at the WTO shows that decoupling of the global economy into two blocks, as opposed to further liberalization, would slash real income at the global level by, on average, about 8.7% when you take into account the lost opportunity cost. And the number is higher for developing countries and LDCs, 10.1% and 11.3%. So the high cost of fragmentation shows that the pull towards globalization cannot and should not be ignored, despite pressures to become more isolationist and self-sufficient, particularly in the area of technology. So I spent the last 2 days on the Hill, and then a week or two ago, I was in Brussels meeting with the European Parliament. And you can anticipate the arguments that I was hearing on both sides. The Inflation Reduction Act on the one hand, the European Green Deal on the other, and these two different approaches. So this definitely is a source of tension. Technology can be a source of tension as governments are trying to figure out what the policy choices will be. To conclude, let me reiterate that the future of globalization will be determined by services and digitalization, leaping us from an arithmetic increase in technology to an exponential one with consequences for trade, both good and bad. To make sure we reap the benefits of this second surge of globalization, we need to make sure we have adequate rules regulating services and digital economy at the global level. And that's where the WTO comes in. So thank you for your attention. I look forward to your comments and questions.
So now I think the idea is that Angela will take some questions from the floor. We have some people who have access to the microphones and they will distribute them around. So if you raise your hand and indicate you have a question you'd like to ask, I think the idea is that we're going to take a cluster of questions together. So we'll take 2 or 3 questions and then Angela will provide a response. So if you have a question you'd like to ask, raise your hand and one of our fellows will distribute a microphone.
Is it okay? Hi, thank you so much for your remarks. Really, truly incredible and insightful. I tend to identify a little bit with the latter. Oh, sure. Yes, I'm Justin Maturo. Have a particular personal interest in trade. I do work on the Hill, unfortunately. I do tend to be a little more cynical these days. I identify probably toward the latter part of your remarks about globalization. If you wouldn't mind elaborating a little bit about the comments you made in the earlier part of remarks about how globalization being in retreat is probably exaggerated. What I see is a lot of, I think in addition to the war in Ukraine and also the effects of COVID, I think the great power competition between China and the United States has pushed the world globe further into these pressures to trade only with their friends and increase tensions between the United States and China. So I guess what I'm saying is, it seems to me as though all the global pressures are pointing to that globalization is in retreat. I just want to hear from you to elaborate further on why you think that might not be true.
Yeah, we have another lady right behind here who would like to.
Thank you so much. I'm Barbara Kochwar from the Visa Economic Empowerment Institute. And sorry, I hate Jesse. Just an amazing, wonderful speech, and you covered so much ground. I was really interested to hear you talk about the MSMEs and the gender digital divide. And I'm so happy that the WTO is thinking about this. I'd love to hear what your reactions have been when you talk about the importance of digital trade for small businesses. I think that generally it's seen as something that's important for large companies like Visa. But we really worry when we look at the last couple of years, we've seen a huge increase in startups. Many of those are women-led, very small businesses that have started to do really well, not just survive, but thrive by exporting and exporting to different markets than we're seeing traditionally. And I think that the WTO and the ITC and the World Bank are seeing similar trends. What do you find are convincing ways to counter the arguments for protectionism? And are we right to be worried about the protectionism, the digital protectionism, sort of the multiplier effects on MSMEs? And then a second question, if I may I, Jesse? Where do you see the role, and perhaps this is the wrong question to ask the WTO, but what do you see as a constructive role for regional trade agreements in the digital trade space?
Gary Horlick, Georgetown Law School. Great to have you here, Angela. What are the major areas do you expect to be on the agenda for possible agreement? I underline possible for the next ministerial.
Yes, this is working. Okay, good. Thank you for all the questions. I'm always really interested to see the kinds of questions people ask, because it shows where your interests are. So it allows me to target my comments. So I do appreciate that. Let me take them in turn. As to whether globalization is in retreat, I think one interesting statistic is that despite everything that's going on, trade between the US and China is increasing. To me, that says something, that even between the two countries where there are such high tensions, tariffs, et cetera, retaliation, we still see an increase in trade. I think and I know there are many business people in the room, and I'd be interested in your views. When I talk to businesses, it doesn't seem that trade is in retreat or that globalization is in retreat. They're trying to find ways to increase trade, whether it's in goods or services or the digital world. And I think that shows that globalization is not in retreat, but it's changing. There's no doubt about it. It's not the same as it was. So we're kind of calling it re-globalization, not de-globalization, because it is changing. There certainly is more of a tendency for countries to make efforts to friendshore. But to me, the fascinating thing about this is that policymakers, politically, it's so popular. The idea is we're going to make everything here, or we're going to trade only with our friends. But there are very few governments that can command that. So it's really interesting to see what business is doing. And I think there is, from what I can observe, more of a tendency not to just simply go for the bottom line. Where can you produce most cheaply, to really trying to develop more resilience in supply chains, more redundancies where it makes sense. And so I think that is a growing trend that we're seeing. But I definitely think that globalization is not dying. In fact, it's changing, like I said, to re-globalization, but policymakers, I mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act, the Green Deal, other efforts by other governments in terms of trying to create incentives for production in that country are really creating quite a debate in the WTO, but also in legislatures all over the world, in boardrooms, as to how these will be implemented. So I think that it is definitely changing. This is not, your father's globalization. This is something new. Barbara asked several good questions here. So on the digital divide and how that's benefited women and MSMEs. It's also benefited, of course, large companies. And I think one thing that we're trying to do at the WTO, and that supporters of digital trade, in my view, should do, is to emphasize that these types of policies, these types of agreements that we're working on at the WTO aren't meant just for large companies. This is, this is an issue that is somewhat controversial, because many developing countries are wondering, well, why do I bother? This is going to help big multinationals. They're not from my country. Maybe I'll get a small piece of the action, but this really, what's in it for me? And I think the point that you made, Barbara, about how women can benefit, how small companies can benefit, and how that becomes a force multiplier in communities, in cities, and in developing countries in particular. It's a very strong argument in support of moving forward. And it's one of the aspects of the negotiations in terms of technical assistance and capacity building that's being undertaken to help make sure that the benefits of digital trade are seen broadly. You asked also about digital protectionism. And I alluded to this, I think, a little bit, and am I worried about it? Yes, I am worried about it. I think sometimes we think of protectionism as being putting high tariffs on products or creating non-tariff barriers in some kind of way. In the digital world, we can see similar types of barriers. We can see all kinds of requirements relating to cross-border data flows, localization of server requirements. Those are just two examples. There are other policies too that I think governments are struggling with as well. So privacy concerns, for example, that's one element where governments are trying to figure out what the right policy choices are. So yes, I am worried about making sure that the new rules as they are established are open and inclusive and are grounded on a sound footing. Your last question was about whether RTAs, regional trade agreements, free trade agreements, can be constructive in this space. And I would say absolutely yes. If you look at USMCA, if you look at CBTPP, if you look at many other agreements, not just US agreements either, agreements that the Europeans are negotiating, the Canadians and others, there are provisions, chapters on digital trade that really are setting the tone for both plurilateral initiatives and hopefully one day multilateral initiatives. So in my view, regional trade agreements are part of the variable geometry of trade, that they are in fact a way to be an incubator for multilateral trade initiatives. And then Gary's question, hi Gary, about MC13. So our next ministerial conference will be held at the end of February in Abu Dhabi. And there are lots of opportunities there, I think, for success. So there's several things that members need to do. One is to consider the moratorium on e-commerce, which expires in March of, by MC13. So whether to extend that moratorium, whether to make it permanent or whether to let it go. Those are basically the options. And how to continue to work on the e-commerce work program. So that's one area. Another area, which is near and dear to my heart, is fisheries negotiations. In MC12, our members concluded a very ambitious and binding agreement to discipline harmful subsidies with respect to fishing in relating to IUU fishing, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, as well as fishing stocks that are overfished. But we still have more work to do. And there's a second wave of negotiations that's just begun. And I mentioned this issue because it answers your question, but also there's a technology element to this as well. Because in order to comply with the obligations on notification and transparency, in order to have a fisheries management system that is effective, you need to have technology. So there are technological aspects to this agreement as well. And of course, we have to help developing countries comply with the terms of these obligations. So that's fisheries. Members are also supposed to examine whether to expand the work that was done on TRIPS, the trade-related intellectual property agreement, the provisions relating to vaccines, whether to extend those to diagnostics and therapeutics. There's also work on agriculture to be done. This is enormously difficult. And my sense is that members are probably going to focus on the food security aspect because some of the questions relating to subsidies and market access continue to be so difficult. The last issue I would mention is reform. And reform takes a whole variety of angles, but I think the one that's been identified as number one is the dispute settlement mechanism. So back at MC12, members agreed that they would restore a fully functioning dispute settlement system that is accessible to all by 2024. So that is a huge focus, and it's something we've been spending a lot of time on to try to see how dispute settlement can be reformed to address some of the issues that the US has raised as well as others, and also to make sure that dispute settlement truly is accessible, in particular to developing and least developed countries who find that it's awfully expensive to bring a case. And if they do win, the remedy is something they really can't execute because it just is so disruptive if they were to impose tariffs, given their very small economies and the small level of trade that they have with the big player. So I think those are a lot of the key issues that we have on tap for MC13.
Okay, thank you very much, Angela. A lot on the plate. We do another cluster of questions if we have microphones available.
Hi, I think I'm next. Is someone going over there? Hi, Angela. Thanks so much for the great remarks. David Weller from Google. You talked at the end about disputes and sort of national security issues and how governments are increasingly seeing technology in a national security context, and certainly more and more of the issues we're seeing around digital do relate to national security. And you mentioned some of the kinds of restrictions that we're seeing impeding trade, whether it be restrictions on data flows or requirement of local storage processing, et cetera, governments are justifying in the name of national security. And I just wanted to get your take on how well you think the WTO can deal with those issues. Obviously, there's GATT 21 and the essential security exception, and there's been a little bit of dispute activity around that, but it's often been considered sort of activity in an area that the WTO can't really touch. So just wanted to get your sense of whether either under the current rules or in the context of the JSI and future negotiations, there are ways to get at those issues in the WTO.
Hi, thank you so much for being here, Angela, and for a great speech. My name is Florencia Ramela. I'm part of the Masters in Management at the McDonald School of Business of Georgetown. My question to you is regarding globalization as well. As you well said, after taking many courses on global supply chain, we can see that globalization is here to stay, but definitely there are different trends. So my question to you is, which are the different trends that you see right now? And what is the WTO thinking about them, and what is in the agenda?
Okay, shall we add one more?
Thank you. Hi, I'm Michelle. I'm from Indonesia and I'm visiting Georgetown now. You mentioned about the importance to facilitate trade in renewable energy generation products, solar panel, wind turbines, and everything. Is there any plan or effort to revive and refine this the environmental goods agreement because it was collapsed in 2016? And how possible is like to make the parties to agree on the list of environmental goods? Because that's one of the reasons why the negotiation collapsed. Thank you.
Well, another cluster of great questions. So I definitely appreciate that. So to David's question, which is a very difficult question, and relating to in the technology world, sometimes the justifications that governments may use for particular policies, whether it's limitations on cross-border data flows, limitations or requirements that you localize your servers, that you keep your servers in country, or other questions relating to privacy, concerns that governments may have that some may call censorship, other issues like that. Also, even within the United States, relating to Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, and the extent to which internet service providers are themselves liable for content. All of these issues are enormously difficult political choices that governments have to make that have a lot of implications. And sometimes governments use national security as a justification for a particular step, or particular act, or particular policy that they may undertake. And so those of you who follow WTO jurisprudence know that at the same time, there's the question of the extent to which a panel should be reviewing something when a government says, this was in my national security interest. And we have now a couple of panel rulings on that topic. That's the subject of a huge in-depth examination And I urge those of you who have not listened to Jennifer Hillman's podcast to do so, because it's an extremely illuminating examination. And Bruce Hirsch, I saw Bruce back there, has also done a fabulous op-ed recently on the topic. But I would say that for us in the WTO, as you know, within the Secretariat of the WTO, but also for our members, the worst way to have to address these issues is through litigation. What is better is for governments, for our members, to try to address these within our committee process, which is extremely active and vital, through our trade policy monitoring mechanisms that we have, where we periodically review every government, every WTO member's policies. There are lots of opportunities through the work programs that already exist to try to address these issues, aside from litigation. Litigation is cumbersome. It takes a long time. Even if we reform tomorrow the litigation system, it still is a win or lose type proposition. And it's really best, I think, for governments to try to resolve these issues bilaterally in groups or multilaterally through the WTO. And I think that this will probably be an important element of reform of the WTO, not just dispute settlement reform, but reform more broadly. We had a retreat recently with all of our WTO members to talk about reform. It was just very interesting to hear what their, does that mean it's time for drinks and reception? I don't know. I'll try to be really quick and answer this question. But I do think that every WTO member has a different view about reform. But some of the issues that, in particular, developing countries are raising in the technology world relating to some of these policy choices that they are exploring, I think shows that members are thinking about this. So as part of our reform, whatever process or steps that are undertaken for that, that can be an important opportunity to address these as well. The next question about trends in globalization and what does the WTO think? It's hard for me to answer that question because the WTO is not a monolith. We are a group of members and a secretariat, and you know, when the WTO acts, it has to be by consensus. But I can tell you what I'm observing in terms of some of the things that that members have said. That, for example, the push towards friendshoring or working with allies, perhaps, is very much growing, and I think can be quite a healthy thing. But I gave you some of the statistics on what we were finding on fragmentation, the cost of fragmentation being a 5% drop in global GDP. And if you take the counterfactual, what would happen if you tried to liberalize the lost, if you add it that way in terms of the lost opportunity cost, it's almost 9% of global GDP. And I think that fragmentation is something we have to really take seriously. I mean, obviously the world is not going to, you know, I hope, divide into two huge blocks. But it's worrisome because the trends are there in terms of the things that some members are talking about, or the logical extension of some of these policies. But I have to say, while I was on the Hill today, I was really interested to see how many members from both parties are quite interested in the idea of working more with allies, that trade policies or economic policies or digital policies or technology policies don't necessarily have to be just the US to be successful. So I took some heart from that trend. And Michelle asked a really good question about the Environmental Goods and Services Agreement, and whether, what would be different this time around. So the negotiations broke down. Those of you who follow this will know, they broke down in 2016 over a dispute about whether bicycles should be included on the list. Well, 2016 was what, 7 years ago. So there's a lot that's changed. The question, the really initial question, the threshold question is what products should be on that list. And if things are controversial, well then, don't include them. But I think there was a lot of agreement on the things that could be included. And in fact, there really already is kind of a list out there that APEC has been developing over the years. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for it. But in order to launch or relaunch this negotiation, we need a consensus from members to do that. We need a sense from members who are willing to speak at the General Council, to speak in our various bodies, to say that this is a priority and they want to see this launched. So there's been a lot of discussion about it, but it is not, it's not launched yet, certainly not. And I think also there's some concern by certain governments that certain other governments would benefit if, we were to launch that. And I think those who are interested in reviving the EGA need to make the case as to why this really shouldn't be looked at as you benefit, therefore I'm against it. And that the question really should be, does this make trade or availability of green technologies, does it make them more available? And does that then have a benefit downstream, upstream and downstream in terms of everything from selling these products, the services that are associated with them, the R&D that goes into it, the manufacturing, the supply chains, all those benefits that would come. Can you make that case? And can you show that as a result of a negotiation like this, like I said, the WTO work has shown that this could decrease global emissions by 0.6%. And when you think about the targets that we're aiming for, that we have to see to avoid disaster, 0.6% is highly significant. So it's a great opportunity for developed countries, for developing countries, and everyone in between. So that's my plug.
Okay, thank you, Angela. So we're probably all anxious to have our wine and our snacks, but we did want to give an opportunity for participants who are not in this room, but no opportunity. Okay. I think we have technical difficulties with our chat. So I think we should probably close it here. So I would just like to thank Angela so much for coming. I'd like to give her a good hand of applause. But before we depart, I would just like to say my personal thank you to Zainab and Mariana, who have been working so hard this week on the Global Trade Academy. And to all the fellows who helped support this activity tonight. So thank you very much. Bon appétit.